Some places do not die when people leave them. They simply wait in silence for someone kind enough to listen. The storm rolled across Blackwater County like a slow-moving shadow, dragging curtains of rain over the sleeping farmland and rattling the naked maple trees that lined the empty highway. The November wind carried the scent of wet earth and pine sap through the cracked window of Ethan Calloway's old Ford pickup, cold enough to sting the lungs every time he breathed. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a silver-gray coat darkened by rainwater and amber eyes that never seemed to miss anything. The dog's ears twitched constantly, listening not just to the storm, but to something deeper hidden beneath it. Ethan drove with one hand resting loosely on the steering wheel, his other hand draped over the faded canvas jacket folded across his lap. At 40 years old, he carried the quiet exhaustion of a man who had spent too many nights sleeping in places never meant to feel like home. His broad shoulders still held the shape of military discipline, though time and loss had softened the sharpness around his eyes. Faint silver touched the edges of his dark brown hair, and several days of stubble shadowed his square jaw. Rain tapped against the windshield in uneven rhythms while the truck's old heater groaned weakly beneath the dashboard. They had been driving north for nearly 6 hours through rural Michigan after Ethan accepted a temporary repair job restoring storm-damaged fencing outside a neighboring county. It wasn't much work, but work had become less about money and more about movement. As long as he kept driving, he didn't have to sit still long enough for memory to catch him. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood high. A low sound rolled from deep inside his chest. Ethan glanced sideways. "What is it, boy?" The dog stared through the passenger window toward the darkness beyond the road. At first, Ethan saw nothing except rain and swaying trees. Then lightning flickered far across the hills, revealing the outline of an enormous greenhouse standing alone near the edge of a frozen lake. The structure appeared almost unreal in the stormlight. Its long glass walls shimmered pale green beneath sheets of rain, and twisted ivy crawled across the iron frame like veins spreading through old skin. Several broken panels rattled softly in the wind. Ranger let out 3 short barks. Sharp, urgent. The same signal he used years ago overseas when something hidden waited nearby. Ethan slowed the truck instinctively. "Easy," he murmured, though his pulse had already begun to tighten. Another flash of lightning illuminated the greenhouse again, and for a brief second Ethan could have sworn movement passed behind the fogged glass. Not a person exactly, more like the shadow of someone crossing slowly through drifting mist. Then it vanished. The narrow gravel road curved toward the property almost as if inviting them closer. Ranger pressed his nose against the window, tail stiff, eyes fixed on the greenhouse with unwavering focus. Ethan hesitated only a moment before turning the wheel. Gravel crackled beneath the tires as the truck rolled toward the isolated structure. The closer they came, the stranger the place felt. The storm seemed quieter here somehow. Muted. The greenhouse stood beside the dark lake like an abandoned cathedral made of glass and rainwater. Rows of dead vines hung behind the windows, brittle and gray beneath layers of condensation. Wind chimes suspended near the entrance swayed gently, though the surrounding trees had gone completely still. Ethan cut the engine. Silence rushed into the cab all at once except for the soft ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of water touching the shore. Ranger climbed down first, paws splashing against shallow puddles. The dog moved cautiously toward the greenhouse door before stopping abruptly. His body stiffened. His ears tilted forward. Then came the sound. Faint, metallic, a soft ringing from somewhere deep inside the greenhouse. Not loud, not violent, just 3 delicate notes drifting through the storm like forgotten music. Ethan frowned slowly. There's no wind strong enough for that. Ranger stared at the fogged glass entrance without blinking. A thin layer of condensation slid slowly down one of the windows, and beneath it Ethan noticed something impossible. Resting inside a cracked flower bed near the doorway was a single white rose. Dead, dry, lifeless. Yet as he watched, one pale petal loosened gently from the stem and floated soundlessly onto the wet floor beneath it. Rainwater dripped steadily from the iron frame above the entrance as Ethan stepped out of the truck, boots sinking slightly into the mud beside the gravel drive. The cold carried a strange stillness now, as though the storm itself had paused to listen. Ranger moved ahead carefully, nose low to the ground, his thick coat glistening beneath the pale glow of the truck headlights. The dog stopped inches from the greenhouse door and stared through the fogged glass without moving. Ethan followed his gaze. Inside, rows of dead vines twisted around rusted wire supports like skeletal fingers frozen in place. Clay pots sat overturned across narrow stone paths. Hanging baskets swayed faintly overhead despite the air outside falling completely still. Another soft metallic ring echoed from somewhere deeper inside. Ethan reached for the handle. Before his fingers touched the brass latch, a warm yellow light flickered on behind the fogged glass. He froze. A silhouette appeared slowly through the misted interior. Small, thin, motionless at first. Then the greenhouse door creaked open with a tired groan of old hinges. An elderly woman stood beneath the dim lantern light, holding a wool blanket tightly around her shoulders. She looked to be in her early 70s, though grief had a way of adding years no calendar counted. Her silver hair was loosely pinned beneath a knitted cap, and faint lines crossed her pale face like cracks in old porcelain. But her eyes were what caught Ethan first. Clear blue, weary, and carrying the distant look of someone who had spent too much time speaking only to memory. Ranger immediately relaxed. His tail lowered gently as he stepped toward her. The woman studied the dog quietly before her expression softened. "Well," she whispered, her voice almost lost beneath the rain. "You are the first living thing that has wanted to come near this place in years." Ethan removed his cap politely. "Sorry if we startled." "You, ma'am. We saw the lights during the storm." She glanced toward the road, as if remembering the weather for the first time. "Storms always wake the greenhouse." The answer settled strangely in the cold air. Ethan was not sure whether she meant it as fact or simply loneliness speaking aloud. The woman opened the door wider. Warm air touched his face, carrying the scent of wet soil, cedar wood, and something faintly sweet beneath years of dust. "You both look frozen," she said softly. "Come inside before the cold settles into your bones." Ethan hesitated only briefly before stepping through the doorway. The greenhouse felt larger inside than it appeared from the road. Long rows of planting beds stretched beneath the curved glass ceiling, disappearing into shadows layered with hanging ivy and cracked wooden shelves. Water dripped rhythmically somewhere in the darkness. Old gardening tools rested neatly along one wall, as if waiting for hands that had simply stepped away for a moment. Ranger moved carefully across the stone floor, ears twitching toward every distant creak and rattle. The woman set her lantern on a nearby work table covered in faded seed packets and brittle flower stems. "My name is Evelyn Harper," she said. "This place belonged to my husband before it belonged to me." Her eyes drifted slowly upward toward the dark ceiling beams. After Walter passed, the flowers stopped growing. Ethan glanced around at the lifeless vines wrapped around iron arches overhead. "Maybe the pipes froze," he offered gently. "Or the heating system failed." Evelyn gave a faint smile that never quite reached her eyes. "The furnace still works when it wants to. The soil is healthy. The lake water still runs beneath the foundation exactly the way Walter designed it." Her voice lowered almost to a whisper. "But nothing blooms here anymore." Ranger suddenly stopped beside a narrow path leading deeper into the greenhouse. The dog stood perfectly still. His ears rose high. A low sound rumbled softly in his throat as he stared toward a section hidden behind hanging canvas sheets near the far wall. Ethan followed his gaze into the shadows. For a brief second, he could have sworn he heard breathing somewhere beyond the dark rows of dead flowers. The sound disappeared almost as quickly as it came, leaving only the soft tapping of rain against the greenhouse glass and the distant groan of thunder rolling across the lake. Ethan narrowed his eyes toward the canvas-covered section near the far wall while Ranger remained frozen in place, muscles tense beneath his damp coat. Evelyn noticed immediately. Her expression shifted with something close to worry. "He hears it too," she said quietly. Ethan glanced back at her. "You have heard that before?" Evelyn lowered herself slowly into an old wooden chair beside the work table. The lantern light painted soft gold across the lines in her face, while shadows gathered gently around the corners of the greenhouse. "Mostly at night," she admitted. "Sometimes it sounds like footsteps. Sometimes water running beneath the floor." She folded her hands together tightly. Walter used to say the greenhouse had its own heartbeat. Ethan looked again toward the hanging canvas sheets. They swayed almost imperceptibly even though the air inside felt perfectly still. Ranger took another careful step forward before lowering his nose toward the stone floor. The dog sniffed along the cracks between the old foundation stones with focused intensity. Ethan recognized that posture immediately. It was the same look Ranger carried during search operations overseas whenever something hidden rested beneath debris or earth. "Mind if I take a look around?" Ethan asked softly. Evelyn nodded after a moment. "Nothing in here has moved much since Walter died." Ethan grabbed the lantern and followed Ranger deeper through the narrow pathways between planting beds. The farther they walked, the colder the greenhouse seemed to become. Moisture clung to the inside of the glass ceiling overhead, distorting the stormlight into pale green shadows that shifted softly across the walls. Dead vines hung from iron arches above them like sleeping memories. Ranger stopped beside an old cast-iron planter near the back corner and pawed once against the stone floor. A hollow metallic sound echoed faintly beneath it. Ethan crouched slowly. He brushed away layers of dust and dirt with his fingertips until the edge of a rusted steel panel appeared between the stones. "That should not be there," Evelyn whispered from behind him. Ethan looked up. "You did not know about this?" She shook her head slowly. "Walter built most of this place before we were married. There were always pipes and valves and strange little systems beneath the floors." Her eyes softened faintly at the memory. "He believed plants listened to people, said flowers grew better when they heard kindness." Ranger pressed his ear flat against the stone beside the hidden panel. Then came the sound again. Faint, rhythmic, water moving somewhere far below them. Ethan slid his fingers beneath the edge of the steel cover and pulled carefully. The old panel groaned open, releasing a breath of cool air carrying the scent of wet earth and mineral-rich lake water. Beneath it, a narrow maintenance shaft disappeared into darkness. Copper pipes lined the walls below, disappearing beneath the greenhouse like veins beneath skin. Ethan lifted the lantern lower. Tiny droplets of condensation clung to the pipes, trembling softly as water flowed through them. "Impossible," Evelyn breathed. "The underground irrigation system stopped working 14 years ago." Ethan frowned thoughtfully. "Some of these pipes are still active." Ranger suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the darkness below. His ears rose high. Then he released a low whine unlike any sound Ethan had heard from him in years. Not fear. Recognition. Somewhere deep beneath the greenhouse, metal creaked softly. A second later, a faint vibration passed through the stone floor beneath their feet. Overhead, several hanging flower pots swayed gently. Then, from somewhere inside the hidden walls of the greenhouse, a quiet rush of water began flowing through ancient pipes that should have been silent for more than a decade. The sound of moving water continued beneath the greenhouse floor long after the pipes should have fallen silent again. Ethan remained crouched beside the open maintenance shaft, lantern light flickering across the old copper lines disappearing into darkness below. Tiny vibrations pulsed through the metal every few seconds, soft but steady, almost like a heartbeat hidden beneath stone. Ranger stood beside him with unwavering focus, ears tilted toward the underground passage while his tail moved slowly once through the cold air. Evelyn lowered herself carefully beside the opening, one trembling hand resting against the rusted edge of the steel panel. Her eyes looked distant now, caught somewhere between fear and memory. "Walter spent nearly 10 years building this place," she whispered. "Most people thought he was obsessed." Ethan glanced up quietly. "Obsessed with what?" A faint smile touched her tired face. "Keeping things alive." Rain slid softly down the greenhouse roof overhead, while the storm outside faded into a low murmur rolling across the lake. The silence inside felt different now, warmer somehow, as though the greenhouse itself had awakened after years of sleeping. Ethan stood and lifted the lantern higher, studying the rows of dead flowers surrounding them. Something about the plants looked strange under the shifting light. He stepped toward the nearest flower bed slowly. The brittle stems still appeared gray and lifeless, yet many of them leaned in the same direction, toward the front entrance, toward the door. Ethan frowned. "Did you arrange these?" Evelyn looked confused. "Arrange what?" He pointed carefully across the rows. "The flowers." She stared for a long moment before her expression slowly changed. Every wilted blossom throughout the greenhouse tilted faintly toward the entrance as though frozen mid-turn. Hundreds of dead flowers facing one direction together. Evelyn covered her mouth softly. They were not like that before. Ranger moved ahead through the narrow stone paths, nose brushing against hanging vines while his claws clicked softly across the floor. The dog stopped beside a tall wooden cabinet near the back wall, almost entirely hidden beneath sheets of dusty canvas. He pawed once against the base. Ethan pulled the cloth away carefully. Inside stood dozens of notebooks stacked beside gardening tools and rolled blueprints tied with twine. Dust drifted through the lantern glow like pale smoke as Ethan opened the nearest journal. The pages were filled with handwritten notes in careful block letters. Water temperatures, soil readings, seasonal bloom cycles. But mixed between the scientific entries were smaller lines written almost like prayers. Every living thing responds to warmth. Plants remember gentle voices. The greenhouse reacts strongest when music is played after sunset. Ethan turned another page slowly. Tucked inside was a faded photograph of a younger Evelyn smiling beside a tall man, wearing work gloves stained with soil. Behind them, the greenhouse overflowed with roses, lilies, and climbing ivy glowing beneath summer sunlight. Walter Harper looked lean and weathered, with kind eyes and the steady hands of someone who built things meant to last. Ranger suddenly stiffened beside the cabinet. His ears shot upward. Then he began pawing gently at the floor beneath the lowest shelf. Ethan knelt immediately. Hidden beneath scattered pots and debris rested a small brass key attached to a leather tag, cracked with age. The words engraved into the leather were barely visible beneath years of dust. South Chamber. Evelyn stared at the key as though seeing a ghost. I have not seen that since Walter died. Ethan looked toward the far side of the greenhouse where the hanging canvas sheets swayed faintly in the dim light. Somewhere beyond them, deeper inside the structure, metal creaked softly beneath the floor again. Then came another sound, very faint this time. A single note drifting through the greenhouse like distant music carried on water. The faint musical note drifted through the greenhouse again, soft and trembling like a memory trying not to disappear. Ethan exchanged a quiet glance with Evelyn before lifting the lantern higher. Ranger moved first, slipping past the hanging canvas sheets with slow, deliberate steps. Beyond them, the greenhouse narrowed into an older section partially hidden from the rest of the structure by rows of overgrown ivy and rusted shelving. The air here felt noticeably warmer. Not warm enough to comfort, but enough to raise goosebumps against Ethan's skin after the freezing rain outside. Water trickled somewhere beneath the stone floor in slow, rhythmic pulses. Ranger stopped beside a curved iron staircase descending beneath the greenhouse foundation. Dust covered the lower steps, untouched for years except for a few fresh droplets of water glistening along the railing. Ethan tightened his grip on the lantern. South Chamber, he murmured quietly. Evelyn stared down into the darkness with widening eyes. Walter never let anyone down there, she whispered. He said it was unfinished. Ranger began descending without hesitation, his claws tapping softly against the iron steps. Ethan followed carefully while Evelyn remained above for several seconds before gathering the courage to step after them. The narrow staircase spiraled into a hidden room beneath the greenhouse, unlike anything Ethan expected to find. Warm amber lights flickered weakly along the walls, powered by an ancient battery system still humming somewhere in the shadows. Copper pipes crisscrossed the ceiling overhead like branches frozen in metal. Shelves lined the underground room from floor to ceiling, filled with glass jars containing carefully labeled seeds preserved beneath wax seals. Lavender, white rose, winter camellia, moon lilies. Ranger moved slowly through the chamber, nose twitching as though the air carried traces of someone long gone. Ethan brushed dust from a nearby workbench cluttered with handwritten notes, gardening sketches, and mechanical diagrams for the underground irrigation system. Then his eyes settled on a small cassette recorder resting beside an old ceramic coffee mug. A single handwritten label remained attached to the tape inside. For Evelyn. Evelyn stopped breathing for a moment when she saw it. Her trembling fingers brushed against the recorder as though afraid it might vanish if touched too quickly. Ethan carefully pressed the power button. Static crackled softly through the tiny speaker. Then came the sound of a man clearing his throat, followed by a warm, familiar voice worn smooth by age and kindness. "If you are hearing this, my love, then Ranger was right." Ethan blinked softly at the mention of the dog's name before realizing Walter must have owned another shepherd years earlier. The recording continued. Beneath the gentle hum of machinery, the greenhouse was never built only for flowers. It was built for healing. Every pipe beneath this place carries warm spring water from the lake because warmth keeps living things from giving up during winter. Evelyn lowered herself slowly onto a wooden stool, tears gathering silently in her eyes. Walter's voice filled the underground chamber like sunlight returning after years of snow. "But flowers are strange, Evelyn. They listen. They lean toward gentle voices. They remember laughter. And when sorrow stays too long, they close themselves against it." Ranger lay quietly at Evelyn's feet while the recording played. The old dog rested his chin softly against her knee as if he understood every word. Walter's voice softened further near the end of the tape. "If the greenhouse ever breathes again, it means you opened your heart before it was too late. Nothing truly loved is ever gone." The tape clicked softly to silence. For several moments nobody spoke. Then somewhere above them, deep inside the greenhouse walls, pipes groaned loudly as warm water surged stronger through the hidden system. A second later, a faint sweet fragrance drifted down the staircase from the darkness overhead. The unmistakable scent of fresh flowers blooming where nothing living had grown for 14 years. The fragrance grew stronger as they climbed back up from the underground chamber, drifting through the greenhouse with the soft sweetness of spring arriving months too early. Ethan could barely believe it himself. Beneath the lingering scent of rain and wet cedar, fresh roses now perfumed the cold night air. Ranger reached the top of the staircase first and stopped near the nearest planting bed. His ears rose high while his tail moved slowly back and forth through the dim light. Ethan stepped beside him and stared in silence. Tiny white blossoms had appeared along one of the dead climbing vines wrapped around the iron archway overhead. Only a few flowers. Fragile, newly opened, but alive. Evelyn pressed both trembling hands against her mouth. Tears rolled silently down her pale cheeks as she stepped closer to the vine. "No," she whispered softly. "That cannot be possible." Her fingers hovered inches from the blossoms before finally touching one delicate petal. It was warm. Ethan watched her expression break apart beneath years of grief she had carried alone inside this silent place. The greenhouse no longer felt abandoned now. The old pipes beneath the floor hummed gently with flowing water. Condensation rolled slowly across the curved glass ceiling overhead, while warm air moved softly through the iron framework, like breath returning to sleeping lungs. Ranger wandered carefully between the flower beds, pausing often to sniff at the newly blooming vines emerging among the dead stems. The dog moved with calm certainty, as though none of this surprised him anymore. Evelyn lowered herself weakly onto a nearby bench beneath the lantern glow. "I shut it all down after Walter died," she admitted quietly. Her voice trembled beneath the sound of falling rain outside. "The heating system, the irrigation valves, everything." Ethan remained silent, letting her speak at her own pace. She stared across the greenhouse toward the dark lake beyond the fogged windows. "After the funeral, I could not stand hearing this place alive anymore. Every sound reminded me of him. The water, the bells, even the smell of the soil." Her eyes glistened softly. "So I locked the doors and waited for the flowers to die with me." Ethan leaned one shoulder against the iron support beam nearby. The lantern light caught the tired lines across his face while the storm slowly faded beyond the greenhouse walls. "Sometimes grief convinces people they have to bury everything that hurt them," he said gently. "Even the good parts." Evelyn looked down at her weathered hands folded tightly in her lap. "Walter used to tell me flowers could feel loneliness." A faint smile touched Ethan's face. Maybe he was right. Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the eastern side of the greenhouse where moonlight now filtered faintly through thinning storm clouds. The dog walked slowly toward a row of large planting beds beneath the windows. Ethan followed his gaze and noticed something impossible. More blossoms had opened while they spoke. Pale white camellias, now spread gently across vines that had looked dead less than an hour earlier. Small droplets of water clung to the petals like glass beneath the lantern glow. Evelyn rose carefully from the bench and stepped closer, overcome with quiet disbelief. "They are blooming faster," she whispered. Ethan crouched near one of the flower beds, running his fingers gently through the warm soil. Beneath the earth, he could feel the faint vibration of water flowing steadily through the underground pipes. But deep down, he sensed this was about more than hidden machinery finally working again. Something inside the greenhouse had shifted the moment Evelyn opened herself to memory instead of running from it. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Clouds drifted apart over the lake, allowing silver moonlight to spill across the greenhouse roof in long, shimmering ribbons. Wind chimes near the entrance stirred softly, though no breeze touched the trees. Ranger sat quietly beneath the glowing glass ceiling, staring upward as if listening to someone Ethan still could not hear. The night settled gently over Blackwater Lake after the storm passed, wrapping the greenhouse in a silence so deep it almost felt sacred. Moonlight poured through the curved glass ceiling in pale silver ribbons, sliding across the stone pathways and newly awakened flowers with a softness that made the entire structure seem suspended between memory and dream. Ethan remained awake long after Evelyn finally drifted to sleep in the small wooden chair beside the workbench. A wool blanket rested across her shoulders while the lantern beside her flickered low and warm. Ranger lay near the entrance at first, calm but alert, his amber eyes reflecting every shifting glimmer of light moving through the greenhouse. The old pipes beneath the floor continued their quiet hum, carrying warm lake water through hidden channels below the roots and stone. Every now and then another flower opened somewhere in the darkness with the faintest sound imaginable, like paper unfolding beneath careful hands. Ethan stood near the eastern windows staring out across the lake. Mist hovered low over the black water while distant pine trees swayed. Gently beneath the clearing sky, for the first time in years, the silence around him no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Ranger suddenly rose to his feet. His ears lifted sharply toward the center of the greenhouse. A low whine escaped his throat. Ethan turned immediately. "What is it, boy?" The dog released 3 soft barks in slow succession before trotting deeper through the rows of flowers. Ethan followed him quickly beneath the iron arches wrapped now with more blossoms than before. White roses climbed along the rusted framework overhead, while pale blue lilies opened silently near the pathways. The scent of fresh earth and blooming petals filled the warm air so completely it almost erased the memory of decay that had haunted the greenhouse earlier that night. Ranger stopped beneath the highest section of the glass ceiling, where moonlight pooled across the stone floor like water. Then Ethan saw it. The glass panels overhead had begun glowing faintly from within, not bright enough to hurt the eyes. Just a soft golden warmth spreading slowly across the curved ceiling as though light itself moved gently through the ancient iron frame. Ethan stared upward in stunned silence. Condensation rolled across the glowing glass in shimmering waves while the old pipes beneath the floor vibrated stronger than before. Somewhere inside the greenhouse walls, hidden gears clicked softly into motion. A moment later, warm air swept upward through hidden vents beneath the planting beds. Evelyn stirred awake behind them. "Walter," she whispered faintly before even opening her eyes. Ethan turned toward her as she slowly stood from the chair, her expression filled with disbelief and wonder. The entire greenhouse now shimmered beneath a warm amber glow that had no visible source. The flowers seemed almost luminous beneath it. Ranger sat quietly beneath the center archway, staring upward as though listening to distant voices carried through the humming pipes and moving water. Then came the sound. Music. Soft at first, almost impossible to hear. Ethan recognized it immediately from the cassette recording below. A piano melody drifting faintly through hidden speakers somewhere beneath. The greenhouse floor. Evelyn covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes again. "He used to play that song while planting winter roses," she whispered. The melody floated gently through the warm air, while more blossoms opened around them in silent waves of color. White camellias unfurled beneath the windows. Deep red roses climbed higher along the iron arches. Pale lavender spread across once barren beds beside the stone pathways. It was as though the greenhouse itself had been waiting years for someone to remember how to love it again. Outside, the surface of Blackwater Lake reflected the glowing greenhouse like a lantern floating in darkness. Several townspeople driving along the distant road slowed their vehicles as the strange golden light shimmered across the water. Inside, Ethan stood speechless beneath the glowing ceiling, while Ranger remained perfectly still at the center of the greenhouse. Ears lifted toward the music only, he seemed to fully understand. By the time the first light of dawn touched Blackwater Lake, the greenhouse no longer resembled the silent ruin Ethan had found during the storm. Morning mist drifted low across the water outside, while pale gold sunlight slowly spilled through the curved glass ceiling, illuminating thousands of flowers blooming where death had lived only hours before. Roses climbed the iron arches in thick, winding ribbons of white and crimson. Lavender stretched across the planting beds in soft waves of violet. Pale camellias glistened beneath droplets of condensation that caught the sunrise like tiny pieces of glass. The warm air inside carried the rich scent of earth, cedar, and fresh blossoms so strongly it felt almost impossible to breathe without remembering something beautiful. Ethan stood near the entrance holding a mug of coffee Evelyn had quietly brewed at sunrise. He had not slept at all. Neither had Ranger. The German shepherd remained stretched beside the central pathway beneath the glowing arches, though the dog's eyes stayed open and watchful, as if guarding something sacred. Every few minutes his ears twitched toward the hidden pipes beneath the floor, where warm lake water still moved steadily through the ancient system Walter Harper had built years ago with his own hands. Evelyn moved slowly through the greenhouse, touching flowers with trembling fingertips, her expression caught somewhere between grief and peace. Sunlight softened the silver strands of her hair, while tears shimmered quietly in her tired blue eyes. He always believed this place could heal people, she whispered softly. I just stopped believing with him. Ethan looked around at the impossible beauty surrounding them. Maybe it waited until you were ready again. Outside, the distant sound of tires crunching over gravel drifted through the morning air. Ranger lifted his head immediately. A few seconds later, an old pickup truck appeared near the lakeside road, slowing as the driver stared toward the glowing greenhouse. Then another vehicle followed. Word traveled quickly in small towns, especially when something impossible appeared beside the lake overnight. By sunrise, several townspeople had gathered quietly outside the greenhouse gates. Nobody spoke loudly. Nobody laughed. They simply stood there beneath the cold November sky, staring through the glass walls in silent disbelief. Some crossed themselves softly. Others removed their hats. An elderly man near the front whispered, I have not seen flowers bloom here since Walter died. Evelyn opened the greenhouse door slowly. Warm, fragrant air drifted outward into the cold morning like breath returning after a long winter. One by one, the townspeople stepped carefully inside. Their boots echoed softly across the stone pathways while sunlight poured through the glass overhead in golden streams. A young mother carrying her little daughter paused beside the roses near the eastern wall. The child smiled brightly before reaching toward one of the blossoms. They feel warm, she whispered. Ethan watched Evelyn closely as she looked around at the people filling the greenhouse again for the first time in 14 years. Her face no longer carried the hollow loneliness he had seen during the storm. Grief still lived there, but something else had returned beside it. Purpose. Ranger moved quietly through the crowd, accepting gentle touches from curious hands. Before returning to Ethan's side, the dog leaned softly against his leg while gazing upward toward the glass ceiling glowing beneath the morning sun. Then Ethan noticed it. Near the center archway where Ranger had first stopped during the night, a single new plaque had appeared hanging from the iron beam above the flowers. Old brass polished clean by moisture and time. Evelyn stepped closer slowly, confusion crossing her face. That was not there before. Ethan brushed his fingers gently across the engraved surface. The words etched into the brass were simple. For every broken heart that still chooses to bloom. Silence settled softly across the greenhouse as everyone read the inscription together. Somewhere beneath the floor, hidden pipes hummed gently beneath the flowers while warm water continued flowing through the roots and stone. And for the first time in many years, Blackwater Lake no longer felt haunted by loss. It felt alive again. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Blackwater Lake over the weeks that followed, though people in town would later swear the season changed the very night the greenhouse bloomed again. Snow along the shoreline melted earlier than expected that year, revealing patches of green grass beneath the birch trees, while soft morning fog drifted across the water like pale silk. The greenhouse became the first place sunlight touched each dawn. Its curved glass walls glowed gold above the lake every morning, warm enough now that condensation rolled constantly across the ceiling even during the coldest hours before sunrise. Ethan stayed longer than he originally planned. At first, it was only to help repair the broken sections of the iron framework and restore the old irrigation valves Walter Harper had designed decades earlier. But days turned quietly into weeks. The greenhouse no longer felt like a forgotten ruin standing beside empty water. It had become something else entirely. A place where people came carrying invisible wounds they no longer wanted to hide alone. Ranger adjusted faster than anyone. Every morning the German shepherd walked the stone pathways between the flower beds, as if performing silent patrols through sacred ground. Children from town often arrived after school, just to sit beside him beneath the climbing roses, while elderly couples wandered slowly through the warm aisles holding cups of coffee and speaking softly about memories they had not shared in years. Somehow the greenhouse encouraged honesty the way sunlight encourages flowers to open. Ethan noticed people smiling more inside those walls, laughing easier, breathing deeper. Even the air felt different there, rich with cedar, lake water, blooming lavender, and the faint warmth of living soil. Evelyn changed too. The heavy loneliness that once followed her like a shadow slowly faded beneath the steady rhythm of caring for the greenhouse again. Her silver hair remained tied loosely beneath knitted scarves, while dirt once more stained the fingertips she had spent years keeping clean. Every morning, she walked through the flower beds carrying Walter's old watering can despite the irrigation system now working perfectly beneath the floor. Plants still like being noticed, she would say softly whenever Ethan offered to do it for her. One quiet afternoon in early March, Ethan stood outside repairing the greenhouse wind chimes while Ranger rested nearby, beneath a patch of sunlight. The lake shimmered pale blue behind them beneath the slow movement of clouds drifting across the sky. Evelyn stepped outside carrying a small wooden box weathered smooth by time. "Walter wanted you to have this," she said gently. Ethan frowned slightly. "Me?" She nodded. "I found it hidden in the south chamber after you repaired the lower pipes." Ethan opened the box carefully. Inside rested an old brass compass beside a folded handwritten note. The compass looked worn from years of use, its glass scratched lightly around the edges. Ethan unfolded the note slowly. Walter's handwriting filled the page in careful, steady letters. "If this greenhouse ever blooms again, it means someone kind enough stayed when leaving would have been easier. The compass once guided me home after the war. Now perhaps it belongs to another tired soldier still searching for his place in the world." Ethan stared silently at the words while wind stirred softly across the lake. Behind him, Ranger lifted his head and walked over quietly, pressing against Ethan's leg the same way he always did whenever emotions grew too heavy for words. Evelyn smiled gently through misted eyes. "Walter would have liked you very much." Sunset arrived slowly that evening, painting the greenhouse glass with shades of amber and gold that reflected across the calm surface of Blackwater Lake. Inside, flowers swayed softly beneath the warm glow of hidden lamps, while distant piano music drifted once more through the pipes beneath the floor. Ethan stood near the entrance beside Ranger, watching the last light settle across the blooming pathways. For the first time in many years, he no longer felt like a man passing through someone else's life. He felt rooted. And somewhere deep within the quiet warmth of the greenhouse, surrounded by flowers that had once refused to bloom, Ethan finally understood something grief often hides from broken hearts. Some miracles do not arrive to erase pain. They arrive to remind people they can still grow after it.